When my daughter-in-law, Clara, finally told me I had to leave, I didn't reach for my son. I didn't beg, and I certainly didn't raise my voice. The moment, which had been years in the making, called for a dignity I didn't know I still possessed. I looked at her, standing in the middle of the kitchen I had spent 40 years tending, and a single, strange thing happened. I smiled. It wasn't a cheerful smile. It was the smile of perfect, devastating understanding. It held no malice, only profound, quiet resignation. I knew, in that instant, that the battle was truly over, and I had lost not just a room, but my central place in the life I had built. "The house is getting too crowded, Mother," Clara had said, her voice completely even, devoid of any genuine emotion. She wasn't angry. She was just efficient. "With Leo growing, and David needing his home office, we need the upstairs suite. You understand, don't you?" I understood that her words were simply the formal notice. The real message was delivered by my son, David, standing silently in the doorway. He was fiddling with his phone, pretending not to hear, pretending not to be part of this conversation. His silence was the betrayal. It was the final vote, casting me out. I simply nodded, keeping that quiet, small smile fixed on my face. "I understand, Clara," I replied. My voice was surprisingly steady. "I'll begin looking for an apartment immediately." I didn't pack that day. I went straight up to my small suite, my sanctuary, and sat in the armchair by the window. The house was silent around me, but inside my heart, the noise was deafening. I felt the slow, heavy ache of profound loneliness settle over me. It wasn't the pain of being rejected by a stranger. It was the pain of being discarded by the two people I loved most in the world, the people I had given everything to. The next morning, the sun rose, and the house felt different. It was the first day of my quiet, necessary exodus. I walked downstairs. Clara was already in the kitchen, meticulously cleaning. She looked at me, saw the calm resolve in my eyes, and seemed to stiffen slightly, perhaps expecting tears or a fight. But I just poured a cup of tea, sat at the kitchen table, my kitchen table, and began to write a list. A list of things I needed to take. A list of memories I needed to leave behind. I had to face the reality. The love I had poured into this home was no longer enough to buy me a place inside it. My life, before the shadow of Clara fell, was defined by comfort, purpose, and a deep, uncomplicated love for my family. It all centered around my husband, Arthur, and our only son, David. Arthur was the kindest man I ever knew. He was a quiet man, an architect who saw beauty in simple, clean lines, and he built not just houses, but a profoundly stable and loving home. We had a marriage built on shared quiet moments, reading together on the sofa, gardening side by side, long evening walks where very little needed to be said. He was my rock, my true partner. When David was born, Arthur and I felt complete. David was a thoughtful, inquisitive child. He was always asking why, and how, and always drawing little blueprints and sketches, just like his father. We taught him the value of honesty, hard work, and above all, unconditional family loyalty. Our home, the very house I was now being asked to leave, was where all our best memories were stored. It smelled of Arthur's pipe tobacco, the old oak wood of the staircase, and the yeast from my homemade bread. It was a haven. Then, the unimaginable happened. Arthur was gone. He passed away suddenly from a short illness when David was 21, finishing his university degree. The loss was a physical blow. The silence in the house was immense, a gaping wound that seemed impossible to close. But tragedy, sometimes, forges unbreakable bonds. In the wake of Arthur's death, David and I clung to each other. I had lost my husband, and he had lost his guiding male figure. We navigated the grief together. I became both mother and father to him, working 2 jobs, a librarian during the day, a proofreader at night, just to keep the house and his future secure. I didn't see it as sacrifice. I saw it as a profound continuation of my love for Arthur, manifested through my commitment to David. Our bond grew so deep that sometimes I felt like we were two halves of the same person. He was sensitive, he was attentive, and he always asked how I was doing. When he excelled in his professional life, my heart swelled with a pride that was almost painful in its intensity. I knew, eventually, he would meet someone. And I genuinely wanted that for him. I wanted him to share the profound happiness Arthur had given me. When he introduced me to Clara, I was immediately supportive. She was striking, fiercely intelligent, and had an ambitious career. She worked in finance, and she carried herself with a sense of control and purpose. I saw her as a successful, modern woman, and I tried to welcome her with open arms. I invited her into my kitchen, the heart of my home, and offered to teach her my grandmother's traditional recipes, the ones that had nourished 3 generations. I gave her Arthur's favorite easy chair, the softest one, as a gesture of making her truly part of the family circle. I didn't see her as someone taking David away. I saw her as someone adding to our family's happiness. I was wrong. I was so utterly, tragically wrong. The decision for them to move into the house was presented as a necessity after little Leo arrived. They needed space, help, and to save money. I was ecstatic. I gladly moved upstairs, giving them the entire main floor, believing I was ensuring my place as the beloved grandmother and caregiver. I saw a future filled with laughter and the sound of tiny feet. I didn't see the silent, cold war that was about to begin for control of David and control of my very home. The last thing I saw before I closed the door to my small, separate suite upstairs was David's smile, thanking me for my generosity. That smile, in retrospect, was the last truly happy, uncomplicated smile I would receive from him for a very long time. The change didn't arrive with a dramatic announcement or a sudden fight. It was much slower, much more insidious. It was a gradual easing out, a quiet, psychological pruning that left me feeling less and less essential, less and less visible. I told myself, every day, that I was overreacting. I told myself I needed to adapt to their modern way of living. But the feeling of being a tolerated guest, rather than the homeowner and matriarch, started to permeate the air. It began almost immediately after they moved into the main floor. I had organized the large kitchen for decades. I knew where every spatula, every special occasion platter, and every spice jar lived. But within a week, Clara had reorganized everything. It wasn't just a simple rearrangement, it was a complete, clinical overhaul. She installed expensive, labeled containers and put a meticulous system in place. One afternoon, I was looking for the large, heavy roasting pan, the one Arthur and I had received as a wedding gift, to make David's favorite Sunday roast. I couldn't find it anywhere. After searching fruitlessly for 10 minutes, I found Clara in the living room, focused intently on her laptop. "Clara, dear?" I asked gently, trying to keep my voice light. "Have you seen the big silver roasting pan? The one with the heavy lid?" She didn't look up immediately. Her typing paused, and she sighed lightly, a sound that felt like mild annoyance. "Yes, Mother. I moved it to the attic storage. We don't use heavy aluminium anymore. It's not safe. I bought a modern, ceramic slow cooker. It's better for Leo's meals." It was the first cut. Not a large wound, but a painful little prick. The pan wasn't just metal. It was a symbol of my marriage, a vessel of family history. And she had relegated it to the forgotten dust of the attic, deemed unsafe and obsolete. I retreated, my hands suddenly empty, and made a simple stew in a small pot in my upstairs kitchenette instead. The kitchen, the absolute heart of the home for me, became her laboratory, and I was given very clear, unspoken rules of engagement. I was welcome to make tea, but not to cook dinner. I was welcome to clean the countertops I used, but not to reorganize anything. The warmth I had always found in that room was replaced by a clean, sterile efficiency. I tried to bridge the gap with food, which was always my love language. I knew David loved my lemon cake. It was the only cake he ever asked for on his birthday. One Tuesday, I spent the afternoon baking it, filling the house with the fragrant scent of zest and vanilla. I placed it proudly on the central kitchen island, a silent offering of love. When David came home, he smiled, genuinely, when he saw it. "Oh, Mom. My favorite. Thank you." But Clara came up behind him, her expression firm. "That's so kind of you, Mother. Truly. But we are having David's colleagues over for a professional dinner tonight, and I already ordered a delicate chocolate torte from the caterer. We really don't need 2 desserts." She moved the lemon cake slightly, pushing it toward the corner. "Maybe you and Leo can share it tomorrow afternoon." The implication was clear. My simple, heartfelt offering was not suitable for her important, professional life. It was just an obstacle to her precise plans. David, sensing the immediate tension, just mumbled, "Yeah, great, Mom, thanks," and quickly changed the subject, asking Clara about her day. His silence was already becoming his shield. The emotional distancing became more pronounced with the arrival of little Leo. I was desperate to be the grandmother I had always dreamed of being. The loving, spoiling presence, the storyteller, the constant support. But every instinct I had was treated as an interference. If I picked up Leo when he cried, Clara would materialize instantly. "Mother, we are trying to encourage self-soothing. Please put him back down." If I suggested a game I used to play with David, it was dismissed as developmentally inappropriate. The biggest shift was in the quiet, shared moments. Before, David and I would share coffee every morning. It was our routine, our 15 minutes of connection. Now, if I came down, David was invariably rushed, already eating the specialized protein bar Clara prepared, looking at his phone. "Good morning, Mom," he would say quickly, without meeting my eyes. "Got to run. Big meeting." If I was making coffee, Clara would hover. "David has to use the specific low-acid blend I bought, Mother. The other kind gives him stomach issues." Again, the implied critique. My decades of care had been fundamentally flawed. I began to feel like an invisible witness in my own home. I was present, but excluded from all vital conversations. They would discuss their finances, their plans for the garden, or Leo's school applications right in front of me. Yet they spoke as if I were a piece of furniture, a silent, non-participating entity. I remember overhearing David on the phone, excitedly planning a weekend getaway with Clara's parents. He detailed every aspect, the restaurants, the sightseeing, the childcare arrangements for Leo, which they had sorted out with Clara's sister. When he hung up, I was sitting right there, reading a book. "That sounds lovely, David," I ventured gently. "I didn't realize you were planning a trip with Clara's family. That's nice." He looked startled, as if he had forgotten I had ears. "Oh, yeah, Mom. Just a quick thing. You wouldn't really be interested. It's mostly corporate talk, you know." Corporate talk. A transparent excuse to explain why his own mother, who lived 10 feet away, was not included in a family weekend. I just smiled, folded the corner of my page, and let it go. The fight, I realized, was never worth the temporary, manufactured peace it would shatter. I was internalizing the pain, keeping it calm, keeping it quiet. That was my pattern now. Quiet sadness over explosive anger. I tried to reach out to David one evening when Clara was out. He was watching a football game. I sat down next to him, placing my hand lightly on his knee. "David, can we just talk for a moment?" He flinched almost imperceptibly, his eyes still glued to the screen. "Sure, Mom. What's up? Is the upstairs shower working okay?" I took a deep breath. "The shower is fine. It's us, David. I feel like I'm losing you. I feel like I'm becoming a stranger in your life. We used to be so close." He finally looked at me, but his eyes were flat, impatient. "Mom, please. This is exactly what I mean. Everything is fine. We are busy. We are raising a family. We have careers. I can't live in the past, Mom. I'm an adult. Clara and I have a way we need to run things. I love you, of course, but you need to understand boundaries. He used that word, boundaries, as a weapon. A simple, polite word that justified his distance and validated my exclusion. He defined the boundary, and my love compelled me to stay outside it, lest I cause him stress. In that moment, watching him turn back to the loud, distracting screen, I knew I had failed to raise a son who would protect his mother's feelings. I had raised a son who prioritized the avoidance of tension above all else. The emotional coldness solidified into a permanent atmosphere. Clara's control wasn't loud, it was structural. She took over the calendar, managing all of David's free time with military precision. She scheduled all the family events with her parents, leaving only scattered, brief windows for me. I remember receiving a text message one afternoon. Family dinner tonight at 6:30 p.m. Just us. I was thrilled. I dressed carefully, wanting to look nice, and went downstairs promptly at 6:30. The dining room was beautiful. Clara, David, and Leo were already seated. As I took my usual chair, Clara looked up, her forehead creased. "Oh, Mother. We were about to start. I meant just our family, the three of us. My sister and her husband are joining us for coffee later. I just needed to talk to David about Leo's school application. I apologize, I should have specified." She didn't offer me a plate. She didn't invite me to stay for the crucial school discussion. She had invited me just enough to make me feel hopeful, only to deliver a quiet, public humiliation. I felt the familiar burn of tears, but I swallowed them down. "I see," I said, rising smoothly, fighting the tremor in my voice. "My mistake. I'll leave you to your discussion. Enjoy your meal." I walked back upstairs and sat in my small bedroom, the silence a heavy blanket around me. I hadn't eaten. I wasn't hungry. I looked out the window at the familiar garden, now feeling miles away, and I finally allowed myself a small, quiet sob. It wasn't a shout of anger. It was a sigh of pure, broken-hearted exhaustion. This pattern repeated itself in different variations. I'd be forgotten in the main living room while they discussed buying a new car. I'd be told not to touch the laundry because Clara had a special setting for David's shirts. I'd receive a passive-aggressive text reminding me to be quieter after 9 p.m. Each instance was small enough to be dismissed as a minor misunderstanding, but the cumulative effect was devastating. I realized that David wasn't just avoiding conflict, he was actively using Clara as a shield to manage his own guilt about moving on. By letting her exclude me, he didn't have to be the bad guy. He could always claim, "It's Clara's decision," or, "She's just very particular." The true pain was understanding that David valued his peace and the smooth running of his new life more than he valued my comfort or my feelings. His silence wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate, protective choice. He chose the path of least resistance, and that path led him directly away from me. I had to face the quiet, terrible truth. My son had become a polite stranger who lived downstairs, and I was the ghost of a former life, quietly haunting the upper rooms of my own home. This quiet, continuous erosion of my presence, this easing out, was slowly preparing me for the ultimate blow. It was conditioning me to expect nothing, so when the final, undeniable rejection came, I would have no fight left. I was being worn down, stitch by quiet stitch, by the silence of the son I had given everything to. The betrayal wasn't loud. It was the soft sound of a door being slowly, irrevocably, closed. After the clear boundaries were established downstairs, I retreated almost entirely to my upstairs suite. It was small, but it was mine. It held the few pieces of furniture Arthur and I had bought together that Clara hadn't deemed obsolete, and it was where I kept the old photo albums and my favorite books. It was my psychological fortress. I knew I needed to respect their space downstairs, but I clung fiercely to the idea that the upstairs was sacred. It was my sanctuary, my place to breathe and grieve the slow loss of my son. But Clara's need for control, I soon learned, respected no walls or boundaries. It began with little things, Subtle intrusions that were impossible to formally object to without sounding petty and hysterical. One morning, I came out of the shower to find a small, neatly labeled plastic basket placed right outside my door. It was labeled, Mother's Laundry Transfer. It contained a note, written in Clara's perfect, precise handwriting. Please deposit all worn towels and bedding here by 7 a.m. We are doing the weekly load. No exceptions for delay. It was not a request, it was an instruction. And the implication was clear. My things, my routine, my very mess, were now part of her systemic management of the house. I was reduced to a functional unit whose waste products needed to be processed efficiently. I folded my hands over the cold basket for a moment. I felt the surge of anger, but it was quickly replaced by that familiar, weary sigh. I simply collected my towels and placed them in the basket. I chose peace over pride, yet again. Then came the rearrangement of my small suite. I had a tiny desk in the corner, where I paid my bills and wrote my letters. It had a lovely view of the old oak tree. One afternoon, I came back from volunteering at the library, and the desk was moved. It was pushed into the shadow of the wall. In its place, Clara had set up a pristine, high-tech baby monitor station, complete with extra camera units. She met me on the stairs, her face bright and helpful. "Oh, Mother, I moved your desk. We need the strongest Wi-Fi signal up here for the new security system. I needed that corner for the primary monitoring station. Isn't it much safer now?" It was framed as a safety improvement, an undeniable good. But I knew the truth. She needed to know, at all times, what was happening in the house. And by pushing my small working space into the dark, she was physically asserting her dominance even in my last private corner. I didn't argue. I just sat at the displaced desk that evening, feeling the cold wall behind me, and looked out at the missing view. The air in my own room felt thin. The emotional invasion escalated dramatically in the lead-up to Leo's 5th birthday. I desperately wanted this day to be different. I needed this one moment of connection to reaffirm my role as the loving grandmother. I spent weeks meticulously knitting a large, complex blanket for him. It was heavy, comforting wool, patterned with little woodland animals, the kind of heirloom that passes down generations. I poured all my thwarted love and quiet hope into those stitches. The party day arrived, full of noise and chaos, which was actually a welcome change from the usual sterile quiet. I stayed busy, refilling the punch bowl and trying to make myself useful without being intrusive. Then came the gift opening moment. Leo sat between David and Clara, tearing through paper. When he finally reached my large, heavy package, I leaned forward, my heart beating in my throat. I watched as he pulled out the finished blanket, the intricate pattern glowing in the afternoon light. Leo held it up, a little confused by its size and weight. "What is it, Mummy?" Clara reached out and took the blanket swiftly. She held it for a brief moment, her face expressionless, and then she delivered the blow with professional ease. "That is very thoughtful, Mother," she announced, her voice slightly amplified in the sudden lull of noise. She addressed the room, not me. "But we have been advised that Leo is sensitive to lanolin. He only wears hypoallergenic, organic cotton now. We can't take any risks." She didn't hand it back to Leo or offer to store it. She placed the beautiful, wool blanket carefully on a distant side chair, folding it neatly so it was barely visible under a stack of commercial paper napkins. It was a complete, public, and deliberate dismissal. My eyes instantly flew to David. I searched his face for any flicker of distress, any sign of defense, any memory of how much he loved the soft, handmade things I had always made for him. But David's face was a mask of strained indifference. He caught my eye for a fraction of a second, saw the raw, exposed pain there, and then he looked away. He focused intently on helping Leo open a loud, plastic robot. That was the moment the betrayal was complete. It wasn't Clara who broke my heart. It was David's silence. His refusal to intervene, his passive acceptance of my humiliation, was his active choice. He chose the path of least resistance, letting his wife manage the awkward rejection, instead of defending my simple act of love. His peace was more important than my dignity. I felt a sudden, profound internal chill. I walked out of the living room and into the quiet hallway. I leaned against the cool wall and closed my eyes. The sound of their happy celebration was now a distant, mocking echo. The blanket was irrelevant. I had just watched my son erase me from his new family history. I spent the rest of the party upstairs, pretending to read, letting the silence heal the public wound. I made a solemn promise to myself. I would not shed a tear in this house, and I would not cause a scene. I would leave with the same quiet dignity I had lived with. A few days later, the final, inevitable confrontation came. Clara stopped me by the staircase. There was no preamble, no soft lead-in. "Mother, I've scheduled a meeting with a realtor for next week," she stated, holding a stack of papers. "We need to finalize the plans for the nursery and the office immediately. It's time for you to find a place of your own." She spoke about my eviction as if she were discussing a plumbing repair, something necessary and logistical. "You're telling me to leave the house I own?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, but steady. "David and I will buy out your share, of course, and the lawyer will handle the paperwork," she replied, completely unmoved. "But yes, the dynamic isn't working, Mother. We need privacy. We need space. This is David's future now, and you need to move on." I looked for David, but he was conveniently absent, at work, of course. His absence was deafening. He had delegated the cruelest task to his wife. I felt the last thread of hope and anger snap. In the absence of hope, there was only calm. I finally saw the situation with absolute clarity. They wanted me gone. And they would get what they wanted. I took a final, deep breath, and that's when the strange, resigned smile returned. "I understand, Clara," I said. "Thank you for the clarity. I will begin looking for apartments today. You won't have to worry about the realtor. I will handle my own exit." It was a small victory, a refusal to let her manage my final steps. As I walked past her, I felt lighter than I had in years. The pain was still immense, a hollow ache in my chest, but the uncertainty was gone. My son had made his choice, not just his wife, but his own peace and his own silence. And in response, I was finally ready to choose myself. I was ready to choose a home where I was the main character, not the quietly ignored background. The rising conflict was over. The exodus had begun. The days that followed my quiet acceptance of Clara's demand were strange. The tension that had choked the air for years was gone, replaced by a profound, heavy silence. It was the silence of a house acknowledging an ending. I started the work of packing the very next morning. It wasn't a rushed, frantic sorting of belongings. It was a slow, ceremonial process, like preparing a library for closure. I knew I couldn't just throw things in boxes. Each object had a story, and I had to acknowledge each story before I could put it away. I began with my small bookcase. I held each book, one by one. There was Arthur's favorite collection of poetry, its pages worn and softened from years of handling. I ran my fingers over the spine, remembering the sound of his voice reading those lines to me in the twilight. Putting that book in a box felt like closing a physical chapter on my life with him. Next were the photo albums. These were the hardest. They chronicled a life of uncomplicated joy. There was David as a chubby toddler, his face smeared with my homemade chocolate cake. There was a picture of Arthur and me standing proudly in front of this house the day we bought it, two young people, full of dreams that now felt so naive. I paused on a photo from David's graduation. He was smiling, radiant, his arm slung tightly around my shoulder. That David, the affectionate, grateful, protective young man, felt like a ghost. He was not the David who was currently avoiding the entire upstairs floor, leaving his wife to handle the messy business of my eviction. I held the picture for a long time, not with anger, but with a deep, sorrowful ache for the son I had lost to adulthood and ambition. I realized that my packing wasn't just about possessions, It was about unpacking the memories and carefully deciding which ones to cherish and which ones to finally release. I decided I would only take the memories that affirmed my own dignity, and I would leave behind the bitterness and the resentment that would only poison my new home. During those days, David and Clara treated me with a distant, strained politeness. They never asked if I needed help packing. They would only ask, quickly, "Have you found a place yet?" David made one attempt at conversation while I was carrying a box of linens down the hall. "Mom, I've scheduled the lawyer to call you on Friday," he mumbled, standing several feet away, blocking his own path back to the main stairs. "Just to discuss the buyout. The amount is generous, you know." I stopped and looked at him. His eyes were averted, focused on a spot on the wall behind my shoulder. "The amount of money is not the point, David," I said, quietly. "The point is the why. You have paid me a price to buy your peace. You have paid me to remove my presence from your life so you don't have to deal with the tension." He flinched. The word peace seemed to strike him hard. "That's not fair, Mom. It's just, Clara and I need to move forward. We need a clear path for our family." "A clear path built on the silence of your mother," I finished for him, my voice still gentle, still calm. "You have bought your peace with my heartbreak, David. And I will take the money, because I need a new home. But I want you to understand the true cost of that check." He stood there, mute, unable to meet my gaze. He couldn't argue, because I wasn't shouting. I was simply stating a painful, undeniable fact. He was a coward in that moment, and I knew it, and he knew I knew it. He offered no apology, only retreat. He squeezed past me and hurried downstairs, disappearing into the noise of his new life. I continued to pack. I realized the turning point wasn't just the eviction notice, it was this forced confrontation with the truth. I had spent so long excusing David's behavior, but now I had to see him as he was. A man who chose convenience over courage, and who valued the smooth flow of his marriage more than the sanctity of our bond. And that clarity, though devastating, gave me strength. I found an apartment. It was small, sunny, and most importantly, it was entirely mine. I handled the lease signing, the utilities, and the moving arrangements all by myself. I refused to ask David or Clara for help. I needed this final act of independence to cement my own strength. The day before the official moving day, my suite was nearly empty. Only one box remained, the box holding my journals, my personal papers, and the photos of Arthur. I sat on the bare floor, surrounded by the echoes of my old life, and I faced the largest remaining internal obstacle, forgiveness. How could I forgive David for his silence? How could I forgive Clara for her cruelty? I opened my journal, turning back to the early pages when they first moved in, charting the beginning of the quiet war. Reading those entries, I saw my own mistakes clearly. I had been too passive, too willing to shrink myself to fit their narrative. I had given my love too freely, allowing it to be mistaken for weakness. I realized that holding on to the bitterness was like drinking poison and expecting David to get sick. It would only destroy my own future peace. Forgiveness was not a gift to them. It was the final, necessary act of choosing myself. I needed to forgive David for being weak so that I could stop being angry and start being free. I needed to forgive Clara for being cruel so that I could stop thinking about her and start focusing on my own new life. I closed the journal. The house was utterly silent. I walked over to the windows and looked out at the garden I had tended for so long. The roses were blooming beautifully. I had taught Arthur how to prune them, and he had taught David. The life cycle continued, with or without me inside the walls. In that profound silence, I felt a weight lift. I wasn't just moving my possessions. I was moving my soul out of a place of sustained pain and into a place of potential joy. I was shedding the identity of the discarded mother and embracing the identity of the independent woman. The next day, the moving truck came. I gave the movers my few boxes and watched them carry my meager possessions away. David was at work, and Clara was out running errands. It was a final courtesy of avoidance. I walked through the empty rooms of the suite one last time, whispering a quiet goodbye to the walls and the memories. I went downstairs. Clara's organized kitchen was immaculate. I found a piece of paper and left a simple note on the pristine countertop. It read, "David and Clara, I have moved out. The lawyers have all the paperwork. Please be kind to each other. Look after the roses. Love, Mom." I didn't ask for a final goodbye. I didn't ask for a hug. I simply closed the front door behind me, the door I had painted, the lock I had replaced, and walked away. The turning point was complete. I was homeless, but for the first time in years, I was truly, beautifully free. I got into the taxi, and I didn't look back. My new apartment was on the third floor of a quiet building just a few miles from my old house. It wasn't large. I could see the kitchen, the living area, and the small balcony all from the central sofa. But it had enormous windows that faced east, letting the morning sun pour in. It felt less like a cage and more like a lantern. The first few weeks were dominated by a strange, almost overwhelming quiet. After years of listening for every sigh, every footstep, and every argument from the downstairs floor, the silence here was absolute. It took time to adjust. I kept waiting for Clara's instructions, for David's hurried footsteps, for Leo's distant laughter. But there was nothing. Only the sound of the wind chimes on my small balcony. I realized that the quiet I had fought for, the peace David had bought, was now finally mine. And I had paid for it with my own isolation, but also with my own freedom. I focused on making the space mine. I put up my favorite curtains, arranged my books, and hung the photos of Arthur and young David, the happy memories, in a place of honor. I deliberately left the walls sparse. I didn't want to clutter the air with too many things. I wanted space to breathe. I started small routines. I'd sit on my balcony every morning with my tea and watch the neighborhood wake up. I started feeding the local birds. These were simple acts, completely unconnected to anyone else's needs, and they felt restorative. I was learning to be a person again, not just a function. The hard moments still came, of course. Sometimes, when the evening shadows lengthened, the loneliness would creep in, sharp and cold. I would remember the feeling of being in the old kitchen, surrounded by family, yet utterly unseen. In those moments, I would allow myself a quiet 10 minutes of sadness. Then, I would remind myself, you chose this peace. You are safe here. I would put on my gentle piano music and start knitting again, this time making things for myself, for the sheer joy of creation. About 2 weeks after I moved, the phone rang. It was David. I hesitated, letting it ring twice. I needed to compose myself, to ensure my voice was steady and calm. I wouldn't let him hear the lingering pain. "Hello, David," I said, finally answering. "Mom," he breathed out, sounding relieved and anxious at the same time. "You finally answered. Are you okay? Did you settle in all right?" I noticed he didn't say, "I miss you," or "I regret how this happened." He asked about logistics, a safe, practical topic. "I'm perfectly fine, thank you," I replied, keeping my voice warm but firm. "The apartment is lovely. Sunny, quiet. Everything is in order." He paused. The silence was his familiar territory. "Good. Good. The lawyer will finalize the transfer next week. Everything is set. Listen, Leo keeps asking for you. He misses the cookies. Would you be up for a video call later this week?" Leo. The lever they always knew how to pull. I knew this was his attempt to ease his guilt, not necessarily to reconcile with me, but I would never punish Leo for his parents' choices. "I would love to see Leo," I said. "But I want to set a boundary now, David. Visits, calls, and emails will only be about Leo and my life. We will not discuss the house, or Clara, or the past. I need peace, and I will not allow tension back into my new home. Can you respect that?" He sounded genuinely surprised by the condition. "Yes, Mom. Yes, of course. I understand." Our first video call was awkward. David held the camera while Leo babbled happily about his new robot, the one purchased on his birthday. Leo showed me his room, which was indeed the old upstairs suite, now painted a cheerful blue. I looked at the familiar window frame, the new paint, and felt a tiny flicker of pain, but I focused on Leo's bright, innocent face. When Leo was distracted, David quickly interjected, "Clara sends her regards." "Thank you," I replied, coolly, ending the conversation about Clara there. The call ended quickly. It was strained, but it was a beginning. I realized that my task now was to maintain that distance, to let David feel the emptiness I had been living with, and to force him to put effort into reconnecting, rather than simply expecting my presence. The geography had changed, and with it, the dynamic of power. The loneliness remained a challenge, but I decided to tackle it not with self-pity, but with purpose. I had always been David's mother or Arthur's wife. Now, I was just I, and I had to fill that I with things that mattered to me. I enrolled in a painting class at the local community center. I hadn't touched a paintbrush since high school. It was terrifying and wonderful. I found a quiet joy in mixing colors and creating something entirely new, something that was an expression of my own internal landscape, not just a reaction to external demands. I also started volunteering at the neighborhood library, reading stories to young children. This felt deeply rewarding. The children didn't care about my past or my status. They only cared about the sound of my voice and the drama of the story. I was appreciated for the simple, fundamental act of sharing. It felt like regaining the nurture I had almost lost. Slowly, gently, I began to form new connections. I met Helen, a kind woman in my painting class who lived alone. We started having coffee once a week. Our friendship was simple and based on shared interests, free of the messy, complicated obligations of family. I was learning to date myself again. Going to movies alone, visiting museums, buying myself flowers. I realized that for years, I had put my happiness on layaway, waiting for David and Clara to validate my existence. Now, I was the sole proprietor of my own joy. I remember one afternoon, I caught my reflection in a shop window. I looked calm. I looked a little tired, yes, but there was a quiet strength in my posture that hadn't been there when I lived in the large house. The exile had forced me to stand taller. I realized that the resolution wasn't going to be a grand reconciliation scene. It was going to be this: the daily, quiet choice to invest in myself, to build a life so full and so resilient that David's past silence couldn't touch it. I was building my own fortress, and this one was made of independence and self-worth. It was a geography of peace, and it was entirely mine. After the initial video call, David started visiting. He came alone, which I appreciated. Clara never joined him, which I found telling. Her exclusion of me was still active, even if I was no longer in the house. The visits were profoundly uncomfortable for David. I saw the guilt radiating off him like heat. He would sit on my small sofa, his gaze darting around the room, always avoiding mine. He'd talk about work, the weather, Leo's latest milestone, all surface topics, careful and safe. He brought gifts, a new, expensive tea set, a large, complicated orchid, a gift card to a fancy restaurant. I accepted them politely, but I always felt the weight of them. These were not gifts of love. They were payments against his guilt. I never initiated any discussion about the past. I didn't ask about Clara. I simply held a calm, non-judgmental space for him. I knew he needed to come to the truth on his own terms. My role was no longer to chase him. It was simply to be present and steady when he finally decided to stop running. I remember one visit. He was rambling about a minor issue with the new home office they had built in my old suite. He paused, fiddling with his coffee cup. "Mom, I'm sorry about how everything went down," he finally mumbled, looking down at his cup. "It was handled badly." "It was handled, David," I corrected gently. I didn't accept the easy, generalized apology. The important thing is that you and Clara have the space you need. and I have the peace I need. But you shouldn't have had to move, he insisted, his voice heavy. Perhaps not, I acknowledged. But I did. And I am well. Let's focus on the good things, darling. How is your project at work coming along? Tell me about that. I refused to engage in the pity party he was trying to start. I wouldn't allow him to relieve his guilt with a superficial apology. He had to sit in the discomfort of his actions. This was an act of tough love, a way to rebuild our foundation on honesty, not just avoidance. The genuine reconciliation began subtly, around the 6-month mark of my move. David brought Leo over for a quick Saturday morning visit. He asked if we could stop by the old house first. I need to grab something from the garage, he explained quickly. And Leo wanted to see the garden. I agreed, keeping my emotions carefully neutral. Walking up to the front door, the house looked the same, but it felt utterly foreign. I was a visitor, and the feeling was oddly liberating. Leo ran straight to the rose bushes, the bushes Arthur and I had planted 40 years ago. They were blooming beautifully, just as I had asked in my note. David stood a few feet behind me. Clara is actually quite good with them, Mom, he said, breaking the silence. I smiled, looking at the vibrant crimson blooms. I'm glad. They were Arthur's favorites. Then, I turned and looked at David. I saw the weariness in his eyes, the pressure of his life. He looked older, burdened. I know you love this garden, Mom, he said, quietly. He wasn't talking about the roses. I should have insisted you stay. I should have told Clara no. I should have stood up for you. But I was afraid of the fight. I was afraid of losing the peace. I didn't realize that the silence I bought was the most expensive thing in the world. He didn't apologize directly, but this acknowledgement, this admission of fear and cowardice, was the truest apology I could have received. He was finally validating my experience, admitting the truth of his betrayal. I walked over to him and placed my hand on his arm, the first affectionate physical contact that wasn't strained in years. Oh, David, I murmured. I forgive you, darling. You were navigating a difficult situation, and you chose the wrong way. But I see your regret. And I see your heart. It wasn't a sudden fix, but it was a release. The tension that had held us captive for years finally dissolved. I didn't hate Clara. I understood David's weakness. And my love for him was deep enough to absorb that human failing. The forgiveness I offered David in the garden was the key that unlocked our new relationship. From that day on, our visits were different. He started relaxing. He would stay longer, talking not just about Leo, but about his own worries, his job stress, and the difficulties he and Clara were genuinely facing. He treated me, finally, not as an obstacle to be managed, but as a confidant to be trusted. I realized that my moving out hadn't just freed me, it had forced David to grow up. When I was upstairs, he could rely on me as a buffer and a safety net. Once I was gone, he had to face the reality of his choices and the solitude of his decisions. He had to become his own man, and that meant acknowledging his mother's value on his own terms. I found a new meaning in motherhood. I was no longer the day-to-day organizer of his life, but the steady anchor of his emotional well-being. This was a richer, cleaner form of love, one based on choice and respect, not obligation. I saw Clara rarely. We maintained a civil distance. I had forgiven her, too, in my heart, but my forgiveness didn't require reconciliation. It required peace, and peace meant keeping the boundaries strong. My journey had taken me from profound heartache to profound realization. The betrayal of my son, while devastating, had been the catalyst for my own rediscovery. I learned that my self-worth was not measured by my proximity to my child, but by my commitment to my own peace and purpose. My story isn't one of revenge or bitterness. It is a story of enduring love and the quiet strength it takes to choose yourself, even when that choice forces the severing of the most cherished bond. I had left a large house, but I had gained a vast, open future. And that, I knew, was the only true inheritance worth claiming. 6 months into my new life, the fear of loneliness, which had been a constant companion in the early days, finally began to fade. It was replaced by a profound appreciation for solitude. I realized that for decades, my identity had been defined by the needs and expectations of others, first Arthur, then David, and then, in a very stressful way, Clara. Now, there were no demands. I could wake up when I pleased. I could eat toast for dinner if I felt like it. I could spend an entire day painting without interruption or explanation. This was the true gift of my forced exile, the ability to listen to my own quiet, internal voice without the constant noise of external needs drowning it out. I found myself rediscovering hobbies that had been lost beneath the weight of domestic management. My painting class became an anchor. I started with simple landscapes, scenes from my memory of the old house garden. But soon, I began painting abstracts, bold colors and flowing lines that seemed to represent the vast, complex emotional landscape I had navigated. My paintings were not commercially good, but they were deeply honest. They were tangible proof that I was still a person capable of creation and expression, not just a relic of the past. I also invested deeply in my new friendship with Helen, the kind woman from the painting class. We were both widowed, both navigating late-life independence. Our friendship was simple, light, and utterly free of the heavy obligations that weighed down family relationships. We talked about art, books, and the simple pleasures of a good cup of coffee. We laughed easily. It was a refreshing, uncomplicated bond. This newfound independence became the core of my strength. I realized that my self-worth was no longer tied to David's approval or my place in his house. It was anchored here, in my small apartment, in my quiet routines, and in my capacity to care for and entertain myself. The work at the library became essential to my emotional health. Reading stories to the children was a beautiful act of pure, selfless nurturing. I was giving love freely, without any expectation of return or fear of rejection. The children accepted my care instantly. They didn't judge. They simply listened. This experience, coupled with my new friendships, forced me to re-examine my definition of family. I had clung so fiercely to the idea that family meant blood and proximity, meaning David, Clara, and Leo in the big house. But now, I saw that family was much broader. It was the community I built. It was the children I read to. It was Helen, who checked on me when I had a cold. It was the kind neighbor who helped me with my groceries. These connections were chosen, not inherited, and they were built on mutual respect and shared kindness, not obligation or guilt. I started to understand that David and Leo were still my family, yes, but they were now only one circle in my life, not the entire universe. And that was a healthy, necessary change for both of us. It freed David from the crushing burden of being my sole purpose, and it freed me from the anxiety of being entirely dependent on him. When David visited now, I was genuinely busy. I didn't rush to clear my schedule. I would tell him, calmly, I can do next Tuesday, but I have my painting class until 4:30, so let's aim for 5 o'clock. This simple act of respecting my own time sent a powerful message. My life continued, full and vibrant, with or without his presence. He had to fit into my world now, rather than me desperately trying to squeeze into his. He responded to this change with maturity. He seemed to respect me more, now that he couldn't take my availability for granted. He never rushed our conversations. He knew I was strong enough to handle his vulnerability, and he knew I was independent enough not to need his pity. The long road back to a healthy mother-son relationship was paved with the stones of my own self-respect. One evening, David came over specifically to talk, without Leo, without his usual hurried demeanor. He brought a simple bouquet of grocery store flowers, and he looked genuinely exhausted. He sat on my sofa, and after exchanging pleasantries, he finally voiced a difficult truth he hadn't touched on before. "Mom," he started, his voice low and halting. "I know I apologized for my silence, but I don't think you ever truly understood how much shame I felt in those years. Every time Clara was cold, every time she moved your things, I wanted to say something. I rehearsed the words in the shower. But I was so afraid. He looked at me, his eyes full of the pain of that memory. I was afraid that if I stood up for you, Clara would leave. We had a baby, we had debt, and she had all the financial control. I was a coward, Mom. A terrible coward. And every time I said nothing, I hated myself a little more. This was the confession I truly needed. Not an apology for the inconvenience, but a raw, honest look into the source of his betrayal, fear and financial insecurity, which Clara had skillfully exploited. Thank you for telling me the truth, David, I said. That is the bravest thing you have done in years. I knew you were afraid, but knowing the specifics of your fear changes things. It doesn't excuse the silence, but it helps me understand the enormous pressure you were under. Your wife put you in an impossible position. I didn't criticize Clara. I simply validated his pain. I emphasized that his weakness was human, and that my love could absorb his failing. You don't have to carry that weight anymore, I finished, squeezing his hand gently. The mistake was made. We both survived it. Now, let's focus on the truth we have today. In that moment, the final, heavy stone of betrayal was removed from our path. The forgiveness was complete, profound, and deeply human. I had found my strength, and by finding it, I had given my son the courage to find his truth. The separation was painful, but it had ultimately cleansed our bond, leaving something stronger and more resilient behind. Life in my small apartment reached a rhythm that was steady, comforting, and entirely my own. I discovered a deep, quiet resilience I never knew I possessed. I realized that the house, the physical structure I had loved so much, had actually been a shell that protected me but also limited me. Once that shell was broken, I was forced to grow stronger than the walls themselves. My friendship with Helen flourished. We often discussed our past lives, comparing the burdens we had carried, the endless obligations, the subtle sacrifices that women often make to keep a family running smoothly. We laughed about the freedom of no longer having to justify a quiet afternoon or an impulsive purchase. This sisterhood, built on shared experience and mutual respect, became a new, essential anchor in my life. I was learning that the most profound and necessary changes in life often arrive disguised as devastating losses. If David hadn't been so cowardly, if Clara hadn't been so cold, I would have stayed in that upstairs suite until I faded away, clinging to the periphery of their lives. The exclusion, though painful, was the brutal act of nature that forced me to reroot myself in new, fertile ground. I started a small blog, just for myself, where I wrote simple, reflective essays about aging, solitude, and the beauty of quiet strength. I didn't publish them widely, but the act of writing, of articulating the pain and the subsequent realization, was incredibly therapeutic. I found a voice that was clear, simple, and honest, the very voice I am using now. I came to understand that true maternal strength isn't about fiercely holding on to your child. It's about raising a person capable of standing on their own, and then having the grace and courage to let them go when they inevitably do. My job as David's mother was complete. My job as my own woman was just beginning. David's visits continued, and they were marked by a genuine, deep respect. He no longer treated me as a problem to be solved, but as a source of quiet wisdom. He often came to me with questions about his career or parenting dilemmas, seeking my opinion as an equal, rather than just seeking my comfort. I realized that even though I was no longer physically present in their home, my influence was stronger than ever. I remember David once confessed that he had finally stood up to Clara regarding Leo's school schedule. He said he had felt a strange moment of clarity, remembering how calmly I had handled my own eviction. I realized, Mom, he told me, looking straight into my eyes for once, that you were never afraid of losing things. You were only afraid of losing me. And now that I know I haven't lost you, I can face anything. I smiled. That's right, David. Fear is what keeps us silent. Courage is simply deciding that being honest is more important than being comfortable. This was the beautiful aftermath of the betrayal. My quiet suffering had inadvertently taught him the courage I had failed to teach him in his youth. He was finally learning to stand up for his own values, even within his marriage. My relationship with Leo also grew into a peaceful, joyous connection. He loved visiting my sunny apartment, which he called Grandma's Art House. We baked cookies, the sugar-filled kind Clara disliked, and we read my old books. I was the grandmother of fun, the one free from the daily stress and rules of the main house. Our time was precious because it was limited and entirely happy. I never criticized Clara to David or Leo. I maintained a policy of absolute neutrality. I focused only on the positive, on the present, and on the strength of our renewed connection. My silence now was a choice of wisdom, not fear. I was protecting the peace I had earned, and by doing so, I was giving David the space to grow without having to defend his wife against his mother. I often found myself reflecting on the philosophical meaning of the experience. We are taught that family love is a constant, a steady light. But I learned that love, especially parental love, must change form. It must evolve from possession to release. The hardest truth I had to accept was that David chose her over me, forever, not out of a lack of love, but out of a deep-seated, complex need to protect his new core unit. His priorities shifted, as it should. The painful part was his failure to communicate this shift with kindness. I realized that my forgiveness was ultimately an act of emotional detachment. I detached my personal happiness from his life choices. I detached my peace from the turbulence in his marriage. And in detaching, I found a deeper, truer attachment to myself. I started seeing the irony of the whole situation. By demanding I leave, Clara had attempted to isolate me. Instead, she had handed me the keys to my own freedom and pushed David into a painful, but necessary, period of self-reflection that ultimately brought him back to me as a better, more honest man. I began to mentor other women through my church and community groups, women struggling with empty nests, the pain of retirement, or conflict with in-laws. I didn't offer advice. I offered my story. I told them about the smile I wore when I was told to leave, and I taught them that quiet dignity is the most powerful weapon against cruelty and cowardice. I told them, don't try to win the argument. Win your peace. Let go of the need to be right, and embrace the power of being free. My life, which had felt like it was ending the day I closed the door to the old house, was in fact reborn. I found a second act, a quieter, richer, and more authentic life. I was no longer defined by the title of mother in residence, but by the quiet strength of my own soul. I was living proof that even the most painful betrayal can become the doorway to profound, beautiful independence. My life had settled into a rhythm of deep satisfaction. I rarely thought about the old house or the painful circumstances of my departure. My world was full of painting, reading, and meaningful connection. I had achieved a level of peace I hadn't known even when Arthur was alive, a peace rooted in self-possession. The final piece of closure, however, came unexpectedly, a year and a half after I had moved out. I was sitting in a quiet corner of a local bookstore cafe, reading one of the classic novels I'd never had time for, when Clara walked in. She was alone, looking tired, her usual sharp focus slightly dulled by worry. She scanned the room, saw me, and hesitated. I knew she had seen me, and I simply nodded a brief, civil acknowledgement, returning immediately to my book. I would not force an interaction, but I would not flee it, either. After a moment, she walked over and stood by my table. "Mother," she said, her voice soft and unfamiliar. "May I sit?" I closed my book and gave her a small, gentle smile. "Of course, Clara." She sat down opposite me, placing her purse on the floor with unusual carelessness. There was a long silence. She didn't launch into an excuse or a complaint. She just looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time. "You look well," she finally said. It wasn't a compliment. It was an observation, tinged with surprise. "I am well," I confirmed. "Life is good here." She ordered a coffee, and when the waitress left, she leaned forward slightly. The facade of efficiency had finally cracked. "I need to tell you something, Mother," she started, her voice barely a whisper. "David and I are getting a divorce." Clara began to talk, and her careful composure dissolved into a painful honesty I had never witnessed before. She confessed that David's admission of his fear, the one he shared with me in my apartment, had been a breaking point in their marriage. Once he started standing up to her, even in small ways, the foundation of her control crumbled. She admitted that she had orchestrated my eviction not because of space, but because of insecurity. "I saw how much David relied on you, Mother," she confessed, her eyes suddenly wet. "I saw the peace he felt just being around you, and I was terrified he would realize he didn't need me. I pushed you out because I was afraid of being replaced. I was afraid of losing control of my new family." She admitted that her obsession with the house, the scheduling, and the endless rules were all attempts to manage a deep, internal anxiety, a fear of chaos rooted in her own childhood. She was trying to build a perfect, impenetrable life to feel safe, and I, the living memory of David's past and a source of effortless love, represented a threat to that structure. She looked at me, her defenses completely down. "I was cruel, Mother. I know that. And I know it was my fault David was silent. I pressured him. I gave him an ultimatum. He chose the mortgage and the baby carriage over his loyalty to you." It was a full, raw confession. It was the confirmation of every suspicion I had quietly carried for years. Yet, I felt no triumph, only a deep, quiet sadness for the pain she was now experiencing. "Thank you for telling me the truth, Clara," I said, my voice soft. "I always suspected your actions came from fear, not malice. Fear makes us do things we regret." I didn't offer her comfort about her marriage. I offered her something more important: understanding without judgment. "I hope you find the peace you are looking for," I finished, offering a simple, clean closure to the hurt. I didn't say, "I told you so," or "You deserve this." I simply gave her my quiet strength, the strength I had spent 2 years building. We parted ways calmly. There was no promise of future friendship, only the quiet acknowledgement of shared humanity and past harm. It was the final, perfect resolution. I hadn't needed her apology to heal, but receiving her truth affirmed my journey. The news of the divorce, though sad for Leo, didn't shatter my peace. David was hurt, but he was resilient. He leaned on me, not as a replacement partner, but as a steady, reliable source of emotional counsel. I helped him navigate the logistics of co-parenting and the emotional difficulty of the separation. Leo spent much more time with me now, and my apartment became his second, comfortable home, a place free of the tension that had once filled the big house. I got to be the full, present, joyous grandmother I had always wanted to be. I realized the profound irony. I had been told to leave because I was too intrusive, too much of a presence. Yet, by being removed, I had become the steady emotional anchor the family desperately needed when their carefully constructed structure failed. My quiet absence had proven my vital importance. My final reflection on this long, quiet journey is this: true family loyalty is not obedience, it is courage. David's mistake was choosing obedience to an unstable marriage over the courage to speak his truth. My victory was choosing the courage to walk away and build a life free from that fear. I learned that motherhood does not end when your child leaves, it simply transforms. It becomes less about managing their life and more about managing your own peace, setting an example of resilience and quiet strength. The betrayal, the cold silence, and the eviction were simply the fire that purified my soul, stripping away the roles I played and leaving behind the woman I was always meant to be. I left behind a large, cold house, but I gained an entire world of self-respect. I would never trade my current peace for the complicated pain of the past. My story is a lesson that even when the dearest person in your life chooses someone else over you, you must always, without fail, choose yourself first. And in that choice, you will find your deepest, most enduring strength. It has been 3 years now since I walked away from the house, the betrayal, and the silence. 3 years of living in this small, sunny apartment that has become my true home. The passage of time has not erased the memory of the pain, but it has polished it, turning it from a sharp wound into a smooth, quiet scar, a mark of survival. My life is centered on my own joy now. I exhibit my paintings at local community shows, I teach a weekly literacy class at the library, and I spend my holidays traveling to nearby coastal towns with Helen. I have found my beautiful second act, a life lived entirely on my own terms. I often reflect on the simple, powerful gift that my forced independence gave me, self-definition. Before, I was defined by my relationships, a wife, a mother, a caregiver. When those roles were stripped away, I was terrified to find nothing underneath. Instead, I found a foundation of strength, creativity, and quiet determination. I learned that true happiness is not found in being necessary to others, but in being complete in oneself. My value was never dependent on whether David chose me. My value existed inherently, simply because I was me. I no longer measure my success by the size of my house or the closeness of my family unit. I measure it by the peace I feel when I wake up, the honesty I share with David, and the capacity I have to give love freely, without any strings attached. I look at David now, and I see a man who is wiser, more honest, and certainly more courageous than the man who stood silently by the door. His mistakes were painful, but they led him to growth, and for that, I am profoundly grateful. Our relationship is cleaner now, built on deep respect rather than complicated obligation. People often ask me how I managed to forgive David, and even Clara, for the way they treated me. They expect a grand explanation or a complex psychological process. But the truth is much simpler. Forgiveness was an act of profound self-preservation. I realized that holding on to the bitterness, the resentment, and the need for justice was like wearing a heavy chain around my own heart. Every time I thought about Clara's cruelty or David's silence, I was actively choosing to ruin my own good day. I was allowing them to occupy space in my mind long after they had lost their power over my life. Forgiveness was the moment I said, "You do not get to live rent-free in my peace anymore." I forgave David because I understood his fear. I forgave him because I recognized that his failings were deeply human, and my love for my child was ultimately bigger than his temporary weakness. His tears, his shame, and his confession were enough. He didn't need to be punished by my anger. He needed to be healed by my unconditional love. I forgave Clara not out of friendship, but out of necessity. Her actions were born of her own deep insecurity and fear of abandonment. Understanding that her cruelty was a symptom of her inner chaos allowed me to view her with pity, rather than hatred. I wished her peace, but I kept my distance. Forgiveness does not always require reconciliation. Sometimes, it requires a clean, final separation. The greatest lesson of forgiveness is that it is a daily, gentle practice of choosing your own tranquility over the need to be right. It is choosing to be the person who walked away whole, rather than the person who stayed bitter. And that choice is the true measure of strength. My story ends here, not with a dramatic reunion in the old house, but with the quiet victory of my own soul. It is a story for every woman who has felt herself pushed to the side, who has been asked to shrink to fit into someone else's life, or who has experienced the unique pain of a child choosing another over her. My final message is this: never, under any circumstances, allow anyone's lack of courage or lack of kindness to diminish your own dignity. When I was told to leave, I could have fought. I could have screamed and cried and demanded my rightful place. But fighting would have only proved their point, that I was dependent, needy, and unstable. Instead, I chose quiet dignity. I chose to smile, to nod, and to simply say, "I understand." And in that choice, I won the war for my own soul. I walked away from a house of bricks and mortar, and I walked toward a life built on solid ground, the ground of my own self-respect. The relationship I have with David today is better because I demanded that respect. I taught him, through my actions, that I was a person of value, independent of him. And that teaching was the best, most lasting gift I could ever give my son. If you are facing your own quiet heartbreak, I encourage you to look inside and find that quiet strength. Don't seek validation from the people who hurt you. Seek solace in the things you love, in the community you build, and in the small, daily acts of kindness you give yourself. The day my son chose her over me was the day I was forced to choose myself. And that choice, painful as it was the beginning of my most beautiful, most authentic life. Look for your own quiet strength. It's always there, waiting for you to claim it.